Welcome back to Shem's Potpourri. I'm Joe Heschmeyer, and I'm excited to tell you that new archaeological evidence has pointed to yet more evidence that the early Christians prayed to the saints. And some of this is very new evidence, as in like December 2024 is when this was announced to the public. And some of this builds on what we already knew. So a little bit of backstory here. On an episode of Catholic Answers Live recently, Cy Kellett asked me about this, if I'd heard about this evidence out of Frankfurt, Germany. And I had not, but I'm very happy to have done so, because the evidence is of what's being called the first Christian north of the Alps. And they realized he was a Christian because he was carrying the oldest Christian artifact ever found north of the Alps. Now, of course, no one thinks he is literally the first Christian north of the Alps, but he's the first one we know about. And this is, in fact, the oldest Christian artifact we know about. We'll get into what that artifact is in a second. It's pretty cool. But first, a little bit of kind of the context here. There was a small Roman city called Nida that was pretty deep into what's now Germany. It's near the city of Frankfurt. It'd be in the kind of Frankfurt suburbs today. But at the time, it was obviously not part of the city of Frankfurt, which didn't exist yet. It was part of the Roman province of Upper Germania, and which is ironically further south, but it's further up the river. So confusing if you're looking at a map, but Upper Germania is below Lower Germania on the map. So Upper Germania, this is the border province, abutting all these different Roman pagan tribes. And in 2018, archaeologists discover an ancient Roman cemetery there. And it's a great find already because a lot of the Roman stuff we have, it comes from further south, places like Rome. And Nida also is pretty old. It seems to have gone out of existence in the later 200s, maybe 270s. As northern tribes like the Alemannia kind of encroached and pushed them out. So it's an ancient Roman cemetery in a place we don't usually find cool ancient Roman stuff. And then they go digging and they realize that one of the skeletons in the cemetery has a little metal box around his neck with a Christian prayer inside. Now, the press descriptions have called this an amulet, and many of those involved in the find seem to think of it as something almost like pagan or almost magical. They don't say pagan, and there's a reason they don't say pagan, but they do use the kind of magical language around it. So, for instance, Goethe University in its press release described it as a small silver amulet, a so-called phylactery, which he probably once wore in a ribbon around his neck. Such a phylactery is a container worn on the body that holds magical contents, or, in later times, relics, and is intended to protect the wearer. But if you're familiar with that term phylactery, you probably also realize phylacteries didn't just have, magical contents or relics, and they're not something coming from paganism, or not only from paganism. There's lots of groups that would wear things around their necks, but the term phylactery signals the fact this is something coming from Judaism. Jesus in Matthew 23, for instance, criticizes the scribes and the Pharisees not for wearing phylacteries, but for widening their phylacteries. It's in this kind of ostentatious way so that people can see how holy they are. And this Jewish practice of wearing phylacteries around, the forearms and the forehead in their cases, comes, again, not from paganism, but from the Bible. In Deuteronomy 11, God instructs the Israelites to bind his words as a sign upon their hands and as frontlets between their eyes. And so this was their attempt to take that as faithfully and literally as they could. Now, there's a long, complicated history of phylacteries within Christianity and a bunch of other cultures, but we know that there's plenty of evidence for Christians following this practice of having some passage of scripture, for instance, or some prayer wound up like a scroll and then placed in a little box around their neck where they could then unroll it and then be reminded to pray. And using it kind of for devotional purposes. Now, it's also true, particularly among the illiterate, we also find them carrying things like relics of the saints. And later on, you even have controversial cases like King Robert II of the Franks, so-called Robert the Pious, despite being threatened with excommunication by the Pope. That's a whole other issue. But you'll find cases like that of someone carrying the host in a pyx around his neck. As a way of being closer to Jesus in the Eucharist. Now, make of that what you will. You can love it, you can hate it, you can be confused by the practice. I'm reminded of two things. Number one, I'm reminded of the modern practice of wearing scapulars. This is something Catholics do, many non-Catholics find kind of weird. But at its best, scapulars are a spiritual aid and a physical reminder of the faith and what we're about. Having something that is right there that, presses against your body can remind you, and many people wear a cross or a crucifix for a similar kind of purpose. Nevertheless, we could also acknowledge that it can be used in a sort of superstitious way that, I don't need to be devout because I've got the scapular or the cross or whatever on. Or if you want maybe an example Protestants might be more likely to relate to, you've got these kind of battlefield examples where there are plenty of real life cases where a musket or a bullet was stopped because a soldier had a Bible in his pocket and the Bible protected him. Now, I think it's totally fair to say that may not have been a coincidence. God may have actually been protecting him in this pretty obvious, sort of miraculous way. And you can believe that, and that's well and good. Now, if you took that in the wrong way, that could become superstitious. You could imagine, for instance, a non-believer having no interest in what the Bible says, nevertheless carrying one just to protect him in battle. That's not really what it's about. So with all of this stuff, with phylacteries, with scapulars, with Bibles in your pocket, all of that stuff, you can use it in a good way or a bad way or a sort of neutral way. I wouldn't jump to, this is like a superstitious, pagan, magical sort of thing. I'm trying to give it a little bit of context as we kind of make sense of what the whole practice of wearing a phylactery even was about. But in any case, what was this German guy's phylactery? Well, the scroll itself was actually too fragile to physically unroll without risk of damaging it, but they used some pretty cool technology. That's a whole other story to digitally reconstruct it. And so here's what we find. But bear in mind, some of the words are impossible to make out, and this is sort of a best attempt at reconstruction. But in any case, it has an invocation to St. Titus, followed by praise of Jesus Christ as holy, holy, holy. This is one of the earliest known uses of this, the thrice holy, which we find liturgically from around this same time period. And then there's a prayer for protection, or perhaps a declaration that the faithful wearer is protected. The writing here is actually a little hard to decipher, unfortunately. And then it closes with a clear reference to Philippians 2, verses 10 to 11, about how every knee shall bend in heaven, on earth, under the earth at the name of Jesus, and every tongue shall confess his name. So several things kind of stand out. Remember, this guy died somewhere between 230 and 270, because this is his grave. This is not when he lived. This is when he died and was buried. The man himself appears to be between 35 and 45 years of age, like me, ominously. And so he was probably born, we can, just doing the math there, he must have been born seemingly between the years 185 and 225 at the latest. So this is quite early. And what's more, prior to finding this guy, the earliest evidence that we had was of a bishop of Cologne in 313 going to the Synod of Rome. So we knew there must have been some Christians in this kind of German area, because you wouldn't have a bishop in a place there weren't any Christians. But we didn't know much of anything about who they were when they showed up or anything. So this guy has now moved that date earlier. Some future discovery may move it earlier yet. But the timing is also significant for another reason. As Goethe University points out, this is a time when Christianity is still illegal. This man was literally risking his life by wearing this around his neck at a time when being discovered with Christian items could mean being tortured and killed. So I want to take what we've just kind of found out with this and apply it to what we've already known. So I want to move now further south to the persecuted Christians in the very heart of the Roman Empire in the city of Rome, who are down there in the catacombs privately worshiping God in the celebration of the Mass at a time when Christianity has been outlawed. The University of Oxford, working with the University of Warsaw and the University of Reading, which is a city, not just a university that teaches people to read, they created a large online database called the Cult of Saints in Late Antiquity that it just aims to gather together all of the early documentation, archaeological evidence for what early Christian devotion to the saints was like from the beginning of Christianity up to about the year 700. And so in that database, we find evidence of, there are hundreds of different inscriptions in graffiti. There's a reason graffiti is an Italian word. It's a long-standing custom of writing on every available wall in Rome. So, and there are hundreds, so like 538 different known instances of graffiti in the catacombs. Not all of them are obviously saying the same thing, but among those 538, we find some pretty interesting things. But the catacomb in question here is beneath the Basilica of St. Sebastian's outside the walls. And this is actually really great because there was an ancient catacombs, and then they, once Christianity was legalized, built a church right on top of where they'd already been going and worshiping. And so that gives us a very clear strata. You know, when you go underneath the church into the ancient catacombs, you know you're, as it were, going back in time from before the church is built in the mid 300s. And so that gives us a pretty accurate date range that when we're looking at this graffiti, we're looking at any things that seemingly couldn't have been earlier than 244 based on some surrounding stuff. And they couldn't have been physically later than 356 because there was a church there where they wouldn't have been able to get in and write on the walls. So we have a nice little range there of a little more than 100 years. But the earlier part of that range is probably more relevant to our purposes because in the year 258, the Roman Emperor Valerian begins persecuting Christians. And in the midst of that, there's some evidence from the chronograph of 354, which is also interestingly where we get evidence of like December 25th for Christmas. Leave it aside. The chronograph of 354 comes up a lot. So in any case, it has this reference. It's kind of cryptic about the Christians moving St. Peter's body to the church of San Sebastiano. And so that, according to the chronograph, happens in the year 258. So we're seemingly looking at mid 200s here, and it couldn't be later than early to mid 300s. And what do we find on these Christian catacombs? Also, sorry, I should add one more thing. Another reason why we wouldn't expect it to be later than the early 300s is Christianity is legalized. Like once you're legalized, you're probably not going to continue to just celebrate in the catacombs on purpose. This was done for a particular reason because, you know, Roman pagans weren't about to like find you out in the cemeteries, in the graveyards, in the catacombs. So what do we find in the catacombs? Again, maybe the 258 period or thereabouts. We find a lot of prayers, particularly to St. Peter and Paul. Now, that's why I'm stressing that Peter's body seems to have been moved there in 258, because it makes sense why you get so many references to Peter and Paul, who are often invoked as a prayer. So you find these prayers like, "O Peter and Paul, keep in your mind, keep in your prayers. And O Paul and Peter, intercede for us all and save. O Peter and Paul, and martyr us and save in the Lord. And O Paul and Peter, intercede for Victor. O Paul, help my father. O Paul and Peter, keep in mind Ophidios, my son." Those kind of things. A lot of these invocations to saints. The point I'm making here is that our German friend isn't the only one with a devotion to a saint. This rather appears to be quite widespread among the early persecuted underground Christians. Now, what are the implications of that? I think this upends the way many Protestants imagine devotion to the saints arrives in the church, by which I mean, I think many Protestants imagine this happens much later, and I think they imagine this is coming from paganism, that, you know, as, you know, Constantine legalizes Christianity, or later when it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, that you get all these pagans that become sort of half Christians, and they keep worshiping their pagan gods, but they slap the name saint on there so that the Roman emperor doesn't know about it. But that's totally wrong, because the Roman emperor wants you to worship pagan gods, and these are the people who are in catacombs because they won't. So I think a pretty representative view is Dr. Gavin Ortland's. He, over on Twitter or X, claims that there was this slow process of accretion by which the surrounding pagan practice began infiltrating the church, until you see in the medieval prayers, in the medieval era, you have prayers that would have scandalized the church fathers. So again, I think that's pretty fair as a representation of what many Protestants imagine. It's not particularly precise. There aren't a lot of names or dates or facts you could check. It's just this kind of loose idea that slowly Christianity went bad. And when, I don't know, maybe the Middle Ages, maybe the Dark Ages, maybe if you're a different type of person, Constantine, or when Christianity becomes the official religion in 380, but it doesn't happen overnight. It's just a slow process, that sort of thing. And then second, you've got that claim that you may have noticed Gavin just sort of throws out, and which I've pressed him on, and I've never gotten any clear evidence to support his claim. This idea that all of this somehow came from paganism. Well, none of this, as far as I can tell, is true. We keep finding earlier and earlier evidence of Christians who have a devotion to the saints, which makes the slow accretion theory have a shorter and shorter time period. Like, if you're going to say this happened slowly, well, it doesn't give you a lot of runway. When we find the oldest known Christian north of the Alps with a clear devotion to St. Titus, and you find the Christians in the catacombs with devotions to Peter and Paul, and you can continue to multiply those kind of examples. I'm reminded, for instance, there were skeptics of Christianity who would claim the New Testament texts couldn't have been written by the apostles, say, because, they were actually written in the 2nd century. And then they were answered ultimately because we kept finding older and older manuscripts that showed that their theory just didn't really work. And so even though we have never found the oldest, like we haven't found the original autographs, maybe we don't have them anymore. And similarly, we're not going to find the first Christian to ever invoke a saint in their prayers. We see directionally, this is getting earlier and earlier and earlier. And so the slow accretion theories become less and less and less plausible, whether we're talking about the slow accretion to get the Bible or the slow accretion to devotion in the saints. It just doesn't work as you get less and less runway to imagine Christianity going bad. But then the second part, as I say, is this alleged, coming from paganism. That makes sense if you buy a slow accretion theory. Once it becomes a popular religion and you got all these pagans who are just doing it to be cool and they're lukewarm and all that, totally makes sense. That's not what's going on here, though. These are the Christians in the catacombs. These are the Christians where it's the lone Christian we're finding in Nida. He's the one guy. The idea that he's, just lukewarmly accepting Christianity doesn't really make sense. And so the idea this is coming from paganism becomes less plausible. It also becomes less plausible, by the way, if you know anything about the history of pagans and their interaction with prayer to the saints. The most famous example is from Julian the Apostate. If you don't know, he was a Roman emperor who, despite being raised as a Christian, rejected Christianity and reverted to, the ancestral paganism of the earlier Roman emperors. Tried to bring the empire back to paganism, unsuccessfully. And he writes these nasty kind of arguments against Christianity in a work called Against the Galileans. And in there, he actually mocks prayer to the saints on, ironically, much the same ground that many Protestants do. His argument is that even the most virtuous men are inferior to the gods, or, a Protestant would say to God. And so therefore it's a waste of time to pray to them. Why would you pray to these incomplete and partial powers? That's his argument. So it's striking that this is not a concession to paganism. The pagans didn't look at the prayer to the saints and say, oh yeah, that's just like what we're doing with the gods. No, they rejected it because they and we understood human saints and Roman gods are not the same thing. You can't just, there's not a one-to-one equation there. This is not, some kind of religious methadone where my devotion to the gods, I can just slap saint in front of it and then keep calling, now I'm not going to call in Mercury, I'm going to call in Saint Mercury. No, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that historically. And we find clear evidence that the pagans were not cool with the Christian practice of praying to the saints. This is, as far as we can tell, a distinctly Christian practice and a practice much older than you might have believed. So 3 final thoughts. Number 1, devotion to the saints is not coming in any obvious way from paganism. Number 2, it's not some late or gradual arrival as far as we can see, but is present in Christianity long before, say, the Nicene Creed. And number 3, we're just getting started. In other words, there's no reason to believe this is going to be the earliest archaeological find we ever have of somebody with an invocation to the saints. And so if you're banking your objection to Catholic devotion to the saints on a slow accretion from paganism kind of theory, that's going to get less plausible, I think, as we move forward, because it's gotten less plausible over the years as we've found more and more evidence that it just simply is not true. So I'm excited by this. I hope you are too. And if you're someone who's maybe uncomfortable with the saints, I hope you're challenged by this and maybe a little more comfortable knowing the earliest Christians, the ones that you hopefully respect because of the authenticity and fervor of their faith, the people who were willing to die for their faith, were totally cool asking the saints for help. And they did it a lot. And we have the evidence to show that. And it seems much more plausible to say, we can trust those guys. They were holy and died for the faith, rather than, oh yeah, that's already pagan Christianity from long before the Nicene Creed. For Seamus Popery, I'm Joe Heschmeyer. God bless you.